Hello again, birdcrafters, and welcome to the warblers. This is the time of year when we've got masses of warblers and of course other migrants pouring into the UK, and the soundscape, the backdrop to our woodlands, to our meadows, to our scrub areas completely changes, and hopefully this particular session will take you through the different warblers in the different locations and the different sounds that you're expecting to hear from them. And by the end of it, of course, you'll all be experts. So we're going to divide up the various localities, the types of habitats that you find the different warblers in. And if you enter a particular habitat, you're sort of pre-armed as to what you anticipate finding. If you go into a dense oak woodland, then there are principally three species that you are likely to encounter, and they are blackcap, garden warbler, and chiffchaff. Each of these birds is able to occupy a niche that is not occupied by a resident bird. That's one of the important factors about warblers, is that they tend to be in localities, they tend to be in habitats, they tend to be in the parts within broader habitat ranges which are not occupied by a resident species. So we're going to take a closer look at the birds we're going to discuss. We're talking about just 14 species of breeding warbler. There are many more species that occur in the UK that pass through that you see maybe particularly in the autumn, but they don't breed here. So divide them up into three groups. We're looking at leaf warblers, we're looking at reed and bush warblers, and we're looking at scrub warblers. They've all got different characteristics, particularly the leaf warblers are small, often greenish, dotting about in the canopy areas. Then you've got the reed and bush warblers. They're usually in more open habitats, often reed beds or very sort of ruderal dominated grasslands, that kind of location. And then you've got the scrub warblers, which tend to be quite well marked birds, but usually quite lumpy in their movements, soft and quite obvious from the tack type calls that they make. Doesn't mean necessarily they're easy to see. For instance, Chetty's warbler, the most recent arrival, well, that's basically got a Klingon cloaking mechanism on it, and it's really hard to spot most of the time. The blackcap is one of our most familiar and also most well studied birds in the UK. It was heavily studied in terms of its migratory behaviour, along with garden warbler. Much of that work was done in Germany using things like emblem funnels to track their migratory movements. The birds that we see now are migrants coming from the Mediterranean, even from just south of the Sahara. They've crossed the Sahara Desert to reach us. But we also have birds in the winter. Now they have come from Austria and Germany. They've left us now. They've gone back to Austria and Germany. They will be breeding there, and our birds are arriving. They're still infilling on territories at this moment, which is mid-April. And they won't have filled in all the territories that they're going to take up until probably the very beginning of May. The males are very obvious when they're singing. They've got those beautiful fluty notes. They've usually got this sort of stanza within the middle of a sort of general ramble, which is really rich, and it's got sort of woodwindy overtones to it, not a harsh sound at all. And it's one of our best singers. Females, of course, don't have black caps, and that can cause some confusion with other species, but the male is pretty distinctive. Rather a grey looking bird. If you look closely, you'll see rather brownish on the back, but that black glotty cap is a bit of a giveaway. As I mentioned a moment or two ago, the female blackcap doesn't have a black cap at all. It's a sort of deep chestnut brown. It sometimes can be very hard to spot, actually. and so it gets mixed up with garden warbler as the common confusion species. The females, just like the males, make these very distinctive tack, tack, tack type calls. You hear like two stones being chatted together. So if you're in a woodland setting and you hear a hard, tacky type sound, you're probably hearing blackcap. Certainly if you're listening anytime from sort of April through to early September, if you're hearing that, it probably is a blackcap. Garden warbler tends to be one of those birds that beginners, inexperienced bird watchers really struggle to identify, both even when they see it and also particularly when they're hearing it singing. There are a number of reasons for that. One of the characteristics of garden warbler is it has very few obvious characteristics. One of the best ways to identify it is that it's a rather bland looking bird but with a rather large eye that stands out, and it's roughly the size of a blackcap, and it tends to be in similar kinds of habitats, and it also is a bit lumpy when it's moving around the vegetation, so it's not got the elegance of, say, a leaf warbler just zipping about. That might help you to identify it and come to the right conclusion. The song is difficult simply because it reminds you of blackcap very much, but it's a longer version with less distinct phrasing and certainly lacks that fluty section that you hear with blackcap. It sounds a little bit fuzzier as well, almost like there's a bit too much spittle in the mouth, in terms of when you're trying to speak, so it's not got the clarity that you're looking for. Chiffchaffs are the real harbinger of spring when it comes to woodland birds. As soon as they arrive, their chiff-chaff, chiff-chaff, chiff-chaff type song that is so distinctive, and of course helps to give the bird its name because it's onomatopoeic. That's just going to be everywhere. I mean, this year particularly, I feel that chiffchaffs have just gone up yet another step in terms of their numbers. They seem to be absolutely everywhere. And the thing about the chiffchaffs is they're quite a small, dainty warbler in comparison to, say, the blackcap and the garden warbler. They arrive quite a bit earlier, particularly than the garden warbler, so you see them first. So they're often in bushes and shrubs and trees that have not got much leaf cover at all, so they're often very easy to see early on particularly. If you listen carefully to the song, you can sometimes hear a bit of a chunter in the middle, so you hear a chiff-chaff, and then a in between that. But you've got to generally be quite close to hear that part of the song. And this particular bird, the chiff-chaff, it's one of those things that in the winter you will see the odd specimen, but by and large the majority of them have migrated southwards, mostly down toward the Mediterranean area. Some of them will cross the Sahara Desert, but the majority are in the Med. And if you go to the Med during the winter, you'll see them feeding on the ground quite a lot, so it comes as a bit of a surprise. Whereas obviously at this time of year, they're up in the bushes and the trees. The famous hanging oak woods of places like North Wales hold a particular community or guild of birds. In terms of the warblers, wood warbler and willow warbler are particularly associated with these habitats, and you may sometimes now see chiff-chaff there. It seems to be spreading into that locality, but principally when you're there, think about wood warbler, think about willow warbler. Willow warblers arrive approximately a fortnight, maybe 3 weeks after chiffchaffs, so they're arriving towards the very end of March. Typically more likely the first few days of April is when you're going to hear them, and they are, as of this moment, mid-April, they're still infilling, they're still coming through. But it was the case that they didn't actually arrive in the UK in any numbers at all until mid-April, about 30 odd years ago. So there's been a definite shift, probably in line with climate change, in that period of time. Unlike chiffchaff, which is a relatively short distance migrant, this bird goes a long way, goes south of the Sahara. As a consequence, it's got longer wings, and if you look really carefully at it, you'll see it's got a much longer primary projection. Where the sort of the bend in the wing is on the folded wing, you can see that the actual primaries are much more extended beyond that than you see with chiffchaff. It doesn't dip its tail in a habitual fashion like you see with chiffchaff. It does that sometimes, but it always usually accompanies it with a bit of a wing flick at the same time. It's a very active, very dynamic little bird, like all the Philoscopus warblers are, and it's up around searching the tops of the trees and the canopy, searching every bud, every leaf for insects. Very active bird. And it also has a very distinctive song, which is that wonderful sort of descending along a line of riffles in a sort of waterfall-ridden river. That's the beauty of the bird in the springtime, that gorgeous sort of descending song. But it also has a call, which is a bit similar to chiffchaff, and most people struggle to separate the two. But if you listen carefully, it's called disyllabic. So it's got a hoo-weet. So it's like think of a U shape, and then you're getting the idea of the shape of the call from a willow warbler. Chiffchaff is a straight through call, almost like a straight line, maybe the slightest of dips in it, but very hard to distinguish unless you're really familiar with the bird. Wood warblers are undergoing a quite dramatic contraction of range in the UK. It wasn't very long ago that this beautiful little bird was not abundant, but it was relatively easy to find in many parts of the region, particularly places like Delamere Forest had reasonable numbers of birds, and you could go in there and listen to that amazing sort of trill call song that they have. And it would be around the sort of the beechwood areas within there, the sort of big open areas with not much ground cover. That's one of the things about wood warbler. They often like areas with little ground cover, despite the fact that they actually nest on the ground, which might be quite surprising. Now, this particular bird is distinct from willow warbler and distinct from chiffchaff because it does like big woods. It's not really a bird of open bushy areas at all, except maybe on passage you might find it somewhere like that then. Very different looking bird when you get a closer look because of that beautiful white belly that it has and the contrasted yellow throat and face. So it does look quite different. Also the yellow fringes on the wings on the primaries and secondary feathers stand out as well. So when you're watching for wood warbler these days, you're thinking about going to places like Aber Valley in Wales, or more likely having to go up as far as Scotland to guarantee seeing them in places like the Killiecrankie Woods and localities like that. It's a sad thing that we're losing it, but you do see it on passage. So it's still round about mid-April is the time when they're coming through. It's one to be listening out for in the next few days. Beech woodland has a particular characteristic about it. It's this sort of often very big, very tall trees, often with lots of gaps and hollows and holes in and all that kind of stuff. But on the ground, there's usually very little in the way of cover. And that's because the dense canopy prevents light reaching the floor, and so there's not much growth. And so it's a bit weird that both wood warbler and chiffchaff are strongly associated with these types of woodland, and both of them breed on the ground. So they must be really good at finding the little nooks and crannies in the base of the trees where they can hide away their nests away from predators. Carr woodland is basically wet woodland, and it's characterised by either willow or alders usually, and scrub. Well, that's obviously familiar to most of you. It's usually the early stages of woodland development, so it's usually got lots of willow and birch and stuff like that, pioneering trees associated with it, and they are both seriously under-regarded as in terms of their importance for wildlife. Particularly certain species of birds are strongly associated with those habitats, as are a whole host of invertebrates, and it's really annoying that scrub has no protection in law because it is although it's a transient habitat, it's a very important one. So in scrub woodland, in willow carr particularly, there are a couple of species that are strongly associated with them. Chetty's warblers seem to love willow carr, particularly where it sort of streams out towards reed bed edges. Willow warblers can be found there as well, as can be blackcap and garden warbler. So Chetty's warbler is an absolutely fascinating species. It's a resident bird in some regards. It is a very short distance migrant, and you can tell that because it's got really short wings, so it's obviously not great at flying great long distances. Didn't establish itself in the UK as a breeding species until 1972 in Kent, and it didn't really spread out from there for a very long period of time. It took ages and ages and ages. I mean, we're talking now looking on 40 odd, 50 odd years for it to really start to spread out. But suddenly it's going great guns. Every year now I find birds in more places. It's infilling as well. So a good example would be Fiddler's Ferry, where a couple of years ago we had 4 or 5 pairs. Now we're talking about 14, 15 pairs within a couple of years, so it's definitely infilling at the moment. One of the things you know about Chetty's warbler is it's nearly impossible to see. It just seems to sit in dense scrub, willow at the edges of wettish areas, and then blasting out this powerful song that just erupts all of a sudden. And it's quite a short song, but it's very powerful while it lasts, and then it might be silent again for 10-15 minutes, and then you get another burst of song. You hardly ever see it out in the open. When you do, you notice that great big rounded tail is rather distinctive, and it's got a big round chestnutty head. But most of the time you sort of see it in one spot, it sings momentarily, and then you don't see it move, and it's singing in another spot. So it's quite a difficult bird to get to grips with. Look out for the eye ring when you do see it. That's one of the things that might help you to identify it. I think most beginner bird watchers don't think about warblers when they go into a grassland habitat, but of course there are certain species that are strongly associated with grasslands of different kinds. Tall herb grassland in particular has a strong pull for grasshopper warbler. Sedge warbler will be there as well, particularly when it's on the edges of sort of wettish areas, and marsh warbler. Well, that is a very, very interesting species indeed, because it requires really tall ruderals, often things like big hogweeds and stuff, to be quite densely populating a grassland before it finds it suitable to nest in those localities. And they are pretty scarce places in the UK, and hence marsh warbler bees are a pretty scarce breeding bird in the UK, but more of that in a moment. Grasshopper warbler is probably one of those birds that most bird watchers never see. It's really difficult to spot. It keeps really low in the sort of dense grassland, usually with a bit of a bramble tangle mixed in there. That's the sort of habitat that you find it in. And you just hear this distant reeling, and that, as if you're hearing, is in the range that allows you to hear this bird because it's quite high pitched. And what you notice about the reeling is that it sort of drifts in and out because the bird turns its head from side to side, and it almost becomes ventriloquial, as if it's throwing its voice around. Very, very difficult to actually locate and pinpoint the spot where the bird is singing from. However, if you go into a grassland, a dense grassland with this sort of mix of tiny bushes and with lots of bits of bramble tangle in there, that's the sort of habitat you're looking for to find grasshopper warbler, and you start to hear it reeling. Look in the edges of the bramble tangles, look for where it's going to creep up just to be visible above. That's where you're going to spot it. It's easier to spot in the early part of the season when it's arriving. It's arriving now, it's arrived in the mid part of April, and it fills in until around about mid-May, and it reaches its peak in terms of numbers of breeding singing birds around about the 14th or 15th of May. So even if you've not got one in your patch right now, it doesn't mean to say there's not going to be one there in a week or so's time. The numbers vary enormously from year to year. Some years they seem to be singing from every available patch, and other years you're really struggling to find them. So they're obviously affected by wintering conditions in Africa where they're coming from. You won't find them up in bushes and trees, except on rare occasions, certainly not being very obvious. And you'll often disturb them as you're walking through grassland and see this bird flying away with its tail bucking away up and down, and slightly fanned as it does so. And that's one of the things that alerts you to the fact you've just disturbed a grasshopper warbler. Sedge warblers are generally associated with wetland habitats, but usually the margins where the reed bed is running out into sort of bramble and scrub, and that's where you get the dense numbers of sedge warbler. You'll also find them quite abundantly on tall ruderal grasslands with wettish patches within there and with lots of bramble and etc. That's the sort of spots that they like. But this particular bird actually does like pure reed beds. The reason it's not in them generally these days is because reed warblers are dominant to them, and they like pure reed beds, and they kick the sedge warblers out. So you're now finding them in what they would consider to be marginal habitats. But because the reed warblers aren't in the rough bramble tangled edges, then they've got a chance to breed in those localities. The song is very similar to reed warbler in the basic structure, except of course it's a giggler, this bird. I've mentioned this many times to you before. It has these sort of sudden rushes within the song, so it's like chunter chunter chunter, and it has a sort of laughing quality to parts of the song cycle. So listen out for that, and that will help you to identify it. They are usually birds that sit quite prominently, particularly on the edges of these reed beds, or as you can see on this particular picture, on the edge of a hogweed or something like that. So at this particular time of year, they're very, very obvious when they're singing. They'll often flight dance in song, which a reed warbler never does, and so that might help you pick it out. However, they only sing for a short period of time. The reason being, as soon as they're paired up, they go stum. So they are become much more difficult to spot. So if you want to go and enjoy singing sedge warblers, do it early in the season. They're arriving from mid-April, and again they reach their peak in terms of infilling all those available breeding spots by early to mid-May. And that's the time to really get out there and listen. And I know we can't go far because of COVID-19, but nearly all of us will be in range of where a sedge warbler may be singing. Marsh warbler is one of our rarest breeding birds. Only a handful of pairs breed, tend to be around the sort of Midlands, southwest Midlands area, and so finding one in the northwest is a rare event. It looks rather like a reed warbler when you see them, often very difficult to distinguish. One of the things I would look for though is that when they sing with their bills very much wide open, whereas reed warblers have them half open. That is one thing that genuinely will help you to identify a marsh warbler. The other thing that really helps you to identify a marsh warbler in full song is it sounds like there's probably about 15 or 20 different types of birds singing from the same spot, because they're incredible mimics and they take on board all the songs of the birds within their locality where they're brought and raised and where they winter. And so you can hear blue tit and blackbirds and grasshopper warbler and all kinds of other things hoiked in and sung by the same bird. And so it sounds like literally there is a choral group of birds singing from one spot. It's an amazing thing. It doesn't arrive until really late, this bird. End of May, beginning of June is when it arrives. It's only here for 2 or 3 months and then it's gone. Chances of finding one in the northwest, maybe once in 25-30 years if you're really lucky. If you go to certain other parts, certainly migration hotspots, then you've got a better chance of coming across them. And I found them in places like the Isles of Scilly and 1 or 2 other localities in the south and southwest. So pine plantations are not a natural phenomenon, are they? They're human agency created habitat, all same age trees going through various growth phases. They become attractive and unattractive to different species at different stages of the life cycle. In terms of warblers, well, the earliest one in is grasshopper warbler just after the trees have been planted and they've not closed up. And there's lots of grasses and other herbaceous plants growing in between. There can be quite good numbers of grasshopper warblers at that stage, but very quickly it becomes unsuitable. Willow warblers will then become the dominant species. As it gets a bit denser, garden warblers will probably come and become part of the population that exists there. But rapidly, as the trees grow and fill in and exclude light to the ground, pretty much all those birds will disappear, and there'll be very few, if any, warblers left within the pine plantation. Of all habitats in the UK with which warblers are probably most closely associated, it will be scrub. The reason being is that scrub is a transient habitat. Historically, it would have been a fairly scarce habitat within the UK, and therefore the resident species were not particularly well adapted to exploiting scrub. That means there are opportunities for species that can exploit it, and the warblers certainly take very well to scrub in its various guises. Several different species associated. Willow warbler loves scrub habitat. Common whitethroat, particularly in the early parts of scrub development within a grassland setting, they are often very common indeed. Blackcap, once it gets a lot denser, they like the scrub habitat when it's really dense, and garden warblers are pretty much the same. You could say the same for lesser whitethroat, but that's a bit specialist. That comes in a bit later when it's getting to high scrub. I'll mention that separately. Common whitethroat is a trans-Saharan migrant, and it winters in an area south of the Sahara Desert referred to as the Sahel. Now, this area is prone to fluctuations in terms of rainfall, and during drought years it really impacts upon the wintering whitethroats, and they can crash in numbers, and it's happened 2 or 3 times in living memory when whitethroat numbers have crashed, and it can often take them many years to recover. Certainly when I was a youngster, I couldn't understand why common whitethroat was called common whitethroat because I hardly saw one. I hadn't realised that just before my birding fledgling period took part, there was a huge drop in the numbers of common whitethroat due to a big drought in the Sahel. It was many years before I realised just how common they could be. It took 30 years for them to recover their full numbers. Probably one of our commonest birds today. They've got a very scratchy song, which many of you will be familiar with. They also do song flights, which again some of you will be familiar with. They've got quite a long tail compared to some of the other warblers, so that's one of the things that you want to be looking out for, rather chestnutty looking on the wings. The whitethroat often looks a bit scruffy, often looks a bit deranged and dishevelled, as does the rather punky crown, particularly when the males are very, very much in song mode. They can look quite spiky crowned. Rarely see them in big trees. They are often associated with the smallest amount of scrub setting within a bramble tangle, grasslandy sort of habitat, but they will go into quite well developed scrub, and it's only when they sort of get into the sort of high scrub that they start numbers. So when I see tall high hedges, the bird that I always bring to mind is lesser whitethroat. It doesn't mean say I'm going to see one because they're not particularly common in my part of the northwest. Certainly in the Cheshire area, on the heavy clays, they're still pretty scarce. When you get to the lighter soils up in the east side of Cheshire, on the big tall hedges, they seem to be a bit more common. And on the free draining sandy areas in Merseyside, again, they're a little bit more common again. Also in the tall high hedges, you will find things like common whitethroats, willow warblers, blackcap, particularly if it's dense, you'll find them. What I noticed about lesser whitethroat in particular, they seem to like an individual tree, like usually an ash tree for some reason, within the hedge, and they'll often centre a territory around that. Lesser whitethroat's not a particularly rare bird, but for some reason we struggle to come to grips with it. I think it's because the tall high hedgerows that it favours are often in inaccessible bits of farmland, and so we just don't come across it unless there's a public right of way close to a suitable area. But now is the time to go out and listen for it. Mid-April is the main arrival period, right through to early mid-May. It'll be singing strongly with that very characteristic unfinished yellowhammer like song. Don't forget I mentioned about it likes a big tree, usually an ash tree, mixed into the hedgerow with the tall high hedgerows. That's where you want to be looking for it. It's a more compact bird than common whitethroat, silky white underneath, and it's usually a bit more free ranging higher up in the trees as well. Common whitethroat tends to be quite low down in the scrubbier margins, so keep listening for that unfinished yellowhammer. Low scrub stroke heathland habitats are really very distinct. They're usually just a small selection of plants, often heathers, often gorse. It's often wind pruned because it's usually either up on a moorland area or it's down on the coastal locality, and it often has just a very small selection of species associated with it. Non-warblers will include things like stonechat, maybe cuckoo, or possibly meadow pipits and stuff like that. But in terms of the warblers, we're basically talking common whitethroat as the really common one. If it's got damp patches within it, you'll probably get the odd sedge warbler. And if it's dominated by heathers with some gorse mixed in, then you start to think Dartford warbler. and certainly some of our best heathlands, most of which are in the south of the UK, Dartford warbler these days has become a relatively common bird, whereas when I was a youngster it was seriously a scarce bird. Hardly any areas could you reliably find Dartford warbler, except after a series of mild winters. Dartford warbler is a non-migrant. It's very habitat specific. It's a heathland species. It likes heathers, often quite rank heather, and it usually wants gorse mixed in as well. It's a very scratchy, rough song that it has. Very, very difficult to spot. It's usually quite skulking in its nature. The other thing is it's a resident species. It's not migratory. And so it is susceptible to hard winters, so its numbers can fluctuate enormously. So areas where it can be abundant now, so if you go to Cannock Chase, for instance, it's not hard to find at the moment, but if we have a really hard winter, then it could be completely extirpated from that area, and you will have to go back down to the south to hopefully find it on the heaths down there. But as it happens, climate change is coming and it is spreading, so any sort of heathy area, whether it be on the Wirral or a bit further up, then there's a chance that you're going to come across Dartford warbler. Listen out for the scratchy song, which you can hear playing on this particular slide as well. So yeah, listen out for that. It's a very dark, small, almost white-throaty type profile, but it's much more skulking than white-throat. Reed beds are really distinctive, aren't they? They're a monoculture habitat. Very easy to identify common reed beds, and of course they've got their own selection of species associated with them, but it varies slightly depending on the nature and the quality of the reed bed. So where you've got pure reed stands, the one species that always stands out is obviously reed warbler. That's a species that has increased in numbers in my lifetime, to the point where when I was very young they were only in very large reed beds in this particular area, and it's only recently, relatively speaking, that they filled in all of the small reed beds and everything, and they drove out the sedge warblers, which were also established in those areas. So sedge warblers now tend to be found on the margins, you know, where the bits of willow are starting to grow in and there's bits of bramble tangles. That's where you're finding the sedge warblers, so not in the pure reed bed stands. Chetty's warbler, well, that likes the more willow occupied parts of the reed bed, and they've become heavily established in the last year or two in the northwest in those kinds of habitats, that transitional habitat between reed to woodland. Savvy's warbler is the one that we're probably never going to come into contact with on a regular basis in the UK, only because there are only 2 or 3 breeding pairs in any given year, usually somewhere like Minsmere down in the south. Now, doesn't mean to say you can't see them up here, because I have definitely seen Savvy's warbler in Cheshire. I found one many years ago singing in Hatchmere in a reed bed there, so that was a bit of a surprise, because I thought it was going to be a grasshopper warbler when I first heard it, but it's much more mechanical and continuous in its sound than is the sound of a grasshopper warbler, so it's a little bit more distinct. Now, the thing about reed beds is they are transitional habitats, and so you can go to a place year on year on year, and gradually the willow will creep in and the composition of the species will change. So unless it's in a managed situation, you will tend to find a successional thing going on with the habitat and a gradual change in the complexity of the species there. One of the things that characterises a British summer these days, anywhere near a reed bed, is the chuntering of reed warblers. That jump, never really getting particularly overexcited, just monotonously carrying on with this kind of conversational style that they have. But they're really not great at emphasising the story. They're really not good at hitting the punchlines like the sedge warbler does. And so it's just almost monotonous in the way that it chunters along. That's what you're listening out for. The bird itself, well, it's changed a little bit in terms of its distribution in the UK. As I mentioned earlier, it was right on the margins, really, of its distribution when I was young, up until my teenage years, and then it started to increase, and along with the climate change of many other species and changes of distribution, it's now well above the Scottish borders in terms of its heartland areas. So as a consequence of that, it became super dominant in reed beds where there were none, and it kicked out the sedge warblers again. I've mentioned that already. The thing with the reed warblers also is that they are found in trees. That seems a bit strange, doesn't it? Because people tell you they don't go into trees. That's not true. In around about 3 weeks' time, the hawthorn trees are going to be in full flower. And where hawthorn flowers alongside a reed bed, I can guarantee the reed warblers will be flying into those trees, those hawthorns, to collect insects for their young. So it's possible to see one in a tree, and it gets very confusing when that happens because you don't expect to see a reed warbler in a tree, and therefore you don't know what it is. So be aware of that. Once the things like the flowering period and the hawthorns are stopped, they probably won't fly up into the trees then until maybe you might see one in a bush or a tree on autumn migration, simply because it's not in the right sort of habitat. So just keep that in mind. And if somebody says, oh yeah, reed warblers never go into trees, you can tell them otherwise. The other thing to note is that in this particular image, you can see that the reed warbler is singing. Just look at that bill, it's only partly open. Do you remember what I mentioned about the marsh warbler with its wide open bill? That will help you to distinguish the marsh warbler and the reed warbler when they are singing. Savvy's warbler, as I've already mentioned, is seriously scarce in the UK, maximum 3 pairs typically in a year. There is always going to be the odd individual bird dotted about here and there singing. There was one in Yorkshire last year, for instance, that was singing for the whole of the summer. So they do turn up, and as I mentioned, I have found one myself in Cheshire, so it's not an impossibility. Much more cricket-like, continuous, mechanical, clean, reeling sound than grasshopper warbler. If you get a good look at it, it's quite distinctive with that big, broad, round tail, rather plain look. It really compares well against reed warbler in that respect. But the sounds like thing is with grasshopper warbler, and grasshopper warbler is a much more streaky looking bird. So if you actually see one singing and it's really plain looking thing like this, then I would start to think about Savvy's warbler. If you go to the continent, it's not a scarce bird in reed bed areas. In the UK, certainly the reed beds I've seen it in, they tend to be occupied not just by reed, but there'll be things like hemlock water dropwort and water dock and stuff like mixed in. They seem to prefer a little bit of variation in the types of vegetation within the reed bed itself. So it's a possibility. keep it in mind anytime you hear a grasshopper warbler seeming to sing from a reed bed area, just keep that in mind. Okay folks, hope you found that useful. There's obviously much to talk about from that. Go away, have your tea, your coffee, whatever it is, have a think, have a contemplate, see what you can come up with. Any questions, I'll be ready for you at 8:45 p.m. when I shall be looking to see your lovely faces or hear your wonderful voices, and we will go through it, and we'll have at least 40 minutes to discuss a variety of things. We're also going to have the odd little quiz as well, as you might imagine. Can't do it without a quiz, and I look forward to spending a little bit of time in your COVID-19 bunker house conditions. Take care folks, see you soon.